The afternoon sun hung low, spilling golden light across the small town's main road. The air shimmered slightly from the heat, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the background. A light breeze pushed dust down the edges of the highway as cars moved lazily through the late-day traffic. Officer Daniel Reeves sat in his patrol car near the edge of the road, sipping coffee that had already gone lukewarm. It had been a slow shift, too slow. Most drivers were careful here. The town was quiet, predictable, and routine. He liked it that way, though he sometimes wished for something to break the boredom. He had been on the force for only 2 years, still learning the ropes, still trying to earn respect. Most of his colleagues were older, local men who joked about the rookies behind closed doors. Daniel didn't take it personally. He knew he had to prove himself. He'd grown up here, watching the sheriff's department as symbols of order and authority. Wearing the badge made him feel proud, even when the job was dull. When the dark SUV passed him on the other side of the road, something about it caught his eye. Maybe it was the tinted windows or the way it slowed for a moment before speeding back up. Daniel straightened in his seat, his hand moving to the radio. He glanced at the license plate, typing the numbers into the onboard computer. The system took a few seconds to load, and while he waited, Daniel noticed one of the rear brake lights flicker. A technical violation, minor but still enough to justify a stop. He thought about letting it go. Most people never noticed a broken taillight, but something in his gut told him to act. He switched on his lights. The red and blue reflections danced across the back of the SUV. For a moment, it kept moving, then slowly rolled to the shoulder. Inside the SUV sat a woman, her hands tightening slightly around the steering wheel. Her name was Marcia Thompson, though Daniel didn't know that yet. She was in her early 40s, well-dressed, with calm eyes that revealed both strength and tiredness. She had just left a community charity event at the local school, where she had been helping organize donations for the winter drive. The back seat was still filled with folded blankets, boxes of canned food, and paper bags labeled for shelter. Marcia took a deep breath as she looked into the rearview mirror. The flashing lights painted her face with alternating red and blue. She wasn't scared, but she felt that familiar wave of unease that came with being stopped on an empty stretch of road. She knew the drill: hands visible, calm voice, polite answers. Even in a quiet town like this, she had learned that caution was always wise. Daniel stepped out of his patrol car and adjusted his sunglasses. He placed one hand on his belt as he approached. He didn't notice the charitable supplies in the back seat, or the calm expression on her face, only the tinted windows and his own restless nerves. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said when he reached her window. "You know why I stopped you today?" Marcia rolled down the window halfway, offering a small, polite smile. "No, officer. I'm not sure." "Your left brake light's out," Daniel said, nodding toward the back. "Also looked like you slowed down suddenly back there. Everything all right?" "Yes," she replied softly. "I was just checking my phone for directions for a moment." "I didn't want to miss the turn." Daniel frowned slightly. "You were using your phone while driving?" "Only for the GPS," she said quickly, trying to stay calm. "I wasn't texting or anything like that." He nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. He scribbled something on his notepad, more out of habit than necessity. Then he asked for her license and registration. Marcia reached toward her purse slowly. "It's just in here," she said, her movements careful. She had done this before. Small town or not, she knew it was best to move gently and narrate her actions. Daniel's eyes followed her hand closely. His body tensed without him realizing it. She noticed it too and spoke softly again. "I'm just getting my wallet, officer." He nodded again, shifting slightly. "All right. Go ahead." When she handed him her license, he glanced at it without reading the name carefully. He didn't recognize it anyway. To him, she was just another driver on a quiet road who had broken a small rule. "I'll be right back," he said. As he walked to his car, Marcia exhaled slowly. She tried to shake off the tension. She looked out at the dry fields on either side of the highway, the long stretch of empty land that always seemed too quiet. She had driven this route dozens of times. It led from the community center back to her home outside of town, a quiet property shared with her husband, who had been the county sheriff for nearly 10 years. But she didn't think about that right now. She didn't want to. She wanted this to go smoothly, like any other stop. In the patrol car, Daniel entered her information into the system. Everything came back clear. No tickets, no record, nothing unusual. He hesitated. Something about the name felt faintly familiar, but he couldn't place it. Maybe he'd seen it in a local report or town notice. He brushed it off. When he returned to the SUV, he stood a little taller, adopting the posture he'd seen senior officers use. "Everything checks out," he said, "but you might want to get that brake light fixed soon. It can be dangerous, especially at night." Marcia nodded. "Thank you, officer. I'll get it taken care of tomorrow." He lingered for a second longer, as if unsure whether to let her go. His eyes drifted to the boxes in the back seat. "What's all that?" "Oh, just supplies from a charity event," she said warmly. "Blankets and food for families in need. We were collecting donations at the school today." Daniel didn't reply right away. Something about her calm tone made him uneasy. Not because of anything she'd done wrong, but because he suddenly felt foolish for how tense he'd been. He cleared his throat. "That's good work you're doing," he said finally. She smiled, grateful for the softer tone. "Thank you. The community always comes together this time of year." He gave a small nod, as if trying to end the interaction gracefully. "All right, ma'am. You're free to go." Marcia felt her shoulders relax slightly. "Thank you, officer. Have a safe evening." He stepped back, signaling for her to merge. The SUV rolled away, the brake light flickering once more as she pulled onto the road. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear into the distance. He didn't know why, but he couldn't shake a faint feeling of regret. Maybe it was the look on her face, the polite calmness that somehow carried a weight he couldn't quite read. He sighed and got back into his patrol car. The sun had dropped a little lower now, the light turning soft and orange. The radio crackled quietly, with another officer reporting a routine traffic stop in a nearby neighborhood. Daniel leaned back and stared out the windshield, lost in thought. He told himself he had done everything by the book. The stop was justified, the driver was polite, and there had been no problem. Still, he couldn't help but feel that something in his tone had been off. Maybe he'd been too sharp. Maybe he'd let his nerves show. Out on the road ahead, Marcia drove silently. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, but her mind replayed the encounter. She didn't like how his eyes had lingered when she reached for her purse, or how his voice had carried an edge she couldn't name. She had done nothing wrong, yet she still felt as though she had to prove her innocence. She turned the radio on softly, letting an old gospel song fill the car. The sound soothed her, even as the light dimmed and the fields gave way to the quiet edge of town. She thought about her husband waiting at home, probably going through paperwork at the kitchen table. He had warned her about driving alone too late, even in their small county. "You never know who's out there," he often said, meaning it both ways. When she pulled into their long gravel driveway, she paused for a moment before turning off the engine. The house stood calm and warm in the fading light. She sat there quietly, listening to the crickets, letting her heart beat slow. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it. It was just a stop, she told herself. Just a young officer trying to do his job. Still, she couldn't shake the unease. Something told her this encounter wasn't truly over, that fate had quietly placed two lives on a path that would soon collide again in ways neither could imagine. Back on the main road, Daniel drove his usual patrol route, his headlights cutting through the twilight. He thought about his job, his training, his need to be respected. He wanted to be seen as competent and confident, someone who could handle himself. But beneath that, there was still a young man trying to figure out what kind of officer he wanted to be. He didn't know it yet, but that small, quiet stop on a nearly empty road would soon become the turning point of his entire career, and the story everyone in the county would be talking about. For now, though, it was just another day ending in the fading light of an ordinary town, with two people driving in opposite directions, unaware that their lives had just crossed in a way that would never be forgotten. The next morning came with soft gray clouds rolling across the sky. The town was still half asleep, and a thin layer of mist floated over the streets. Marcia stood by her kitchen window, stirring a cup of tea, watching the steam rise and curl. The events from the day before still lingered in her mind, though she tried not to dwell on them. Her husband, Sheriff James Thompson, sat at the table reading through a pile of reports. His brow furrowed in concentration, and the faint hum of the radio played from the corner of the room. He looked up as she set her cup down. "You're quiet this morning," he said gently. She smiled a little. "Just tired." "Yesterday was long," he nodded. "That charity event went well, though. People are still talking about how much you raised." "It did," she said softly. But something else happened on my way home. He looked up immediately. What do you mean? I was pulled over, she said, keeping her tone calm. One of your officers, I think. Young guy. He said my brake light was out. James frowned. Who was it? I didn't catch his name. He was polite enough at first. A little tense, maybe. Nothing serious. Her husband leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. Did he say or do anything out of line? No, she replied, shaking her head. Not exactly. It just felt uncomfortable. I don't want to make a big deal of it. He was probably just doing his job. James sighed. Still, I'd like to know who it was. You shouldn't have to feel uneasy, especially in this county. Marcia reached across the table and touched his hand. It's fine, really, I just want to forget it. He studied her for a moment longer before nodding slowly. All right, but promise me you'll tell me if something like that happens again. I will, she said with a small smile. The rest of the morning passed quietly. James left for work and Marcia went about her chores. She fixed the broken tail light at the auto shop, ran a few errands, and tried to focus on her volunteer plans for the weekend. But now and then her mind wandered back to that moment by the roadside. The flash of lights, the voice through the window, the feeling of being watched too closely. She reminded herself that not every encounter was a threat, that sometimes people simply acted on nerves or misunderstanding. Still, it stayed with her, a quiet discomfort that wouldn't quite fade. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Daniel Reeves sat in his car outside the station, waiting for his partner for the morning shift. He hadn't slept much. The encounter from the day before played in his mind again and again. The way the woman had looked at him, calm but disappointed somehow, had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He told himself he hadn't done anything wrong. The stop was legal. His actions were by the book. Yet something inside him whispered that maybe it wasn't about rules at all. Maybe it was about how people felt during those moments. About how authority could look different depending on who was wearing the badge and who was standing outside the car. He shook off the thought as his partner, Officer Lopez, walked over with 2 coffees. Morning, rookie, Lopez said with a grin. You look like you saw a ghost. Daniel forced a laugh. Just tired. Yeah, we'll get used to it. You're on patrol again tonight. Night shift needs coverage, Daniel groaned softly. Great. They spent most of the morning driving through the quiet neighborhoods, checking on small reports and keeping an eye on the school zone. By noon, the clouds had cleared and the streets buzzed with kids leaving early for a half day. Lopez leaned back in his seat. You know, you've been jumpy lately. What's on your mind? Daniel hesitated, then said, I stopped a woman yesterday for a busted brake light. It was fine, but I don't know. Something about it felt off. Lopez raised an eyebrow. Off how? She was calm, nice even. But I felt like I was being too rigid, maybe. Like I overreacted, Lopez chuckled. That's part of it, man. Everyone's tense these days. You just make sure you're polite and follow procedure. Don't let people read you wrong. Yeah, Daniel said, but he didn't sound convinced. The rest of the shift was uneventful. They handled a noise complaint, helped a stalled driver, and checked on a missing dog report. Ordinary things. But as the sun began to set, Daniel found himself near the same stretch of road where he'd stopped the woman the day before. The memory flashed again. Her calm face, her careful tone, the folded blankets in the back seat. He slowed down without realizing it, staring at the shoulder of the road where her car had been. Back at home, Marcia was preparing dinner when her husband returned. She smiled when she saw him step through the door, dusting off his hat. How was your day? She asked. Busy, he said, setting down his bag. We had to handle a few calls about the new construction site. Some kids were trespassing again. She laughed softly. Boys being boys, he nodded, then added casually, I asked around the office today. Found out who stopped you yesterday. Her hands paused as she set the table. You did? Yeah, young guy named Reeves. Good record so far. Still green, though. I think he's just cautious, maybe too cautious sometimes. Marcia nodded slowly. I figured he was new. He looked nervous. James shrugged. He's not a bad kid. Just needs time to learn how to talk to people without letting the badge talk for him. She smiled faintly. That's a good way to put it. They sat down to eat and the conversation drifted to lighter topics. The fundraiser, the town parade next month, a friend's new baby. But deep down, Both of them carried quiet thoughts they didn't voice. For Marcia, it was the memory of standing by the road, feeling small under flashing lights. For James, it was the image of one of his officers stopping his wife without knowing who she was. A harmless situation, yes, but still unsettling. The next few days passed peacefully. The county fair arrived, filling the streets with laughter, food stands, and bright colors. Daniel worked security there, patrolling the crowd and answering simple questions from families. He saw Marcia once, though he didn't realize it was her at first. She was at a booth helping children pick out school supplies donated by local businesses. When their eyes met briefly, recognition flashed across both faces. She gave him a polite nod, a soft smile that held no anger. Daniel nodded back, unsure what to say. She didn't stop to talk, and he didn't try to. Still, that moment stayed with him for the rest of the day. Later that night, as he packed up cones near the parking lot, Lopez joked, "You've been quiet again. Thinking about something?" Daniel looked toward the fairground lights fading in the distance. "Just thinking about how people see us. You know, the uniform." Lopez shrugged. "People see what they want to see. You just do your job." But Daniel wasn't sure that was enough anymore. Over the next week, his shift pattern changed. He was assigned to more highway patrols, the same road where he had first stopped her. He drove it often now, sometimes catching himself slowing at the same spot, as if expecting something to happen again. On one of those evenings, a call came through about a minor accident near the county border. Daniel was nearby and responded. When he arrived, 2 cars had pulled to the side. No one was hurt, just shaken. One of the drivers was Marcia. She stood beside her SUV, talking calmly to the other driver, a young man who kept apologizing. The bump had barely left a scratch, but both had wanted to report it just in case. Daniel approached slowly, his steps careful. Marcia looked up and recognized him instantly. "Evening, officer," she said, polite but reserved. "Evening, ma'am," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. "Everyone all right?" "Yes, we're fine." "Just a little bump." He nodded and took their statements, jotting notes quietly. His tone was softer this time, less formal. He could feel the difference. This time he wasn't speaking from a place of authority, but from awareness. When everything was settled, Marcia thanked him. "You handled that very kindly," she said. He hesitated, then replied, "I appreciate that. I hope our last encounter didn't make you uncomfortable." Her eyes softened. "It did a little, but I understand. Sometimes people don't see the whole picture." He nodded, the words sinking deep. "I'm trying to be better at that." For the first time she smiled. A real one this time, small and genuine. That's all anyone can do. As she drove away, Daniel stood by the roadside watching the taillights disappear into the dusk. He felt something shift inside him. Not guilt exactly, but awareness. A quiet understanding of how small moments can shape how people see each other. When he returned to the station that night, he found the sheriff in the hallway checking reports. James gave him a polite nod. "Good work out there, Reeves. I heard you handled that fender bender well." "Thank you, sir," Daniel said. The sheriff paused, studying him for a second longer. "By the way," he added with a faint smile, "that woman you helped tonight, she's my wife." Daniel froze. The world seemed to still for a moment. He opened his mouth, but no words came. James patted his shoulder lightly. "Don't worry. She told me you were respectful. Keep it that way." As the sheriff walked away, Daniel stood there in stunned silence. The woman he had stopped, the one he judged without knowing, was the sheriff's wife. He exhaled slowly, realizing how small the world could be, and how easily one action, one choice could change everything that came after. The night sky hung heavy over the town with soft clouds drifting across a pale moon. The streets were quiet except for the sound of crickets and the occasional car humming in the distance. It was one of those evenings when everything seemed calm on the surface, though something deeper stirred beneath it. Officer Daniel Reeves sat in his patrol car by the roadside, his radio crackling softly in the background. He had been on duty since sunset, watching headlights appear and disappear down the long highway. It was routine, familiar, but his mind wasn't resting. Ever since the sheriff told him that the woman he had stopped was his wife, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of shock that had settled inside him. He had played that first encounter over in his mind countless times. Every tone of voice, every look, every choice. He had treated her like a stranger, and now he realized she was someone deeply respected in the town, someone who gave to others, who helped people in quiet ways. It wasn't about her being the sheriff's wife that bothered him most. It was the fact that he had looked at her through suspicion instead of humanity. The radio snapped him out of his thoughts. Unit 23, possible disturbance reported on County Road 6, check it out. He picked up the mic. Copy that. I'm close by. He turned on his headlights and pulled onto the main road. The tires hummed against the asphalt as the town lights faded behind him. County Road 6 stretched out into open land, a quiet route bordered by tall grass and scattered farms. The report didn't sound serious, but Daniel stayed alert. Out here, things could change fast. As he approached the curve near an old barn, he saw the faint glow of hazard lights ahead. A car was parked on the shoulder and someone stood near it waving. He slowed down and turned on his spotlight. It was Marcia. She was wearing a long coat, her hair tied back, her face calm but clearly relieved to see him. Her SUV was the same one from before, only now one of the tires looked flat. Daniel parked behind her and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. Evening again, ma'am, he said, his voice steady but cautious. You all right? She smiled lightly, though there was fatigue in her eyes. Flat tire. I must have hit something back there. I tried calling roadside assistance, but the signal's terrible out here. He nodded, walking around to look at the damage. Yeah, looks like a nail or something. Do you have a spare? In the back, I think, she said. All right. I'll take care of it. She hesitated. Oh, you don't have to do that, officer. I don't want to trouble you. It's no trouble, ma'am. You shouldn't be out here alone at night anyway. He went to the back of her car and opened the trunk. Inside were boxes from her charity work, a folded blanket, and the spare tire. He lifted it out and started loosening the bolts. The air was cool and quiet except for the faint hum of insects. After a few minutes, he looked up and smiled slightly. You know, I never expected to see you again so soon. Marcia laughed softly. Neither did I. They worked in silence for a while, the quiet only broken by the sound of metal against metal. When the tire was replaced, Daniel stood up and wiped his hands on his pants. That should get you home safely, he said. Thank you, she replied sincerely. I really appreciate it. He nodded, glancing at the horizon where distant thunderclouds were beginning to form. You might want to hurry. Looks like a storm's coming. She looked up and smiled. Seems like there's always one coming. He caught the meaning in her tone, a quiet truth said not about the weather but about life itself. For a moment, they just stood there. Two people from different sides of the same town, bound by chance and circumstance. Then the radio crackled again. Unit 23, what's your status? Daniel picked up the mic. All clear. Just assisting a motorist. Back en route shortly. He turned back to her. You're good to go, ma'am. She gave him a grateful nod and started toward the driver's seat. But before getting in, she paused. You've changed since the first time we met, she said kindly. He looked surprised. Changed? Yes, you seem calmer, more grounded. That's a good thing. He smiled a little, feeling the truth of her words. I've been thinking a lot lately about how people see us when we wear this uniform. It's easy to forget that respect goes both ways. She nodded softly. You're learning something that some people never do. Her words stayed with him long after she drove away. Later that night, Daniel returned to the station. The storm had arrived by then, with rain pelting the windows and wind howling through the trees. Inside, a few officers sat drinking coffee, sharing stories about the day's calls. The sheriff was in his office, his light still on. Daniel knocked on the open door. Sir? The sheriff looked up. Come in, Reeves. He stepped inside, removing his cap. Just came from County Road 6. Helped your wife with a flat tire. The sheriff smiled slightly. She told me. Said you were kind. Daniel nodded. I'm glad I could help. The sheriff studied him for a moment. You've been quiet lately. Everything all right? Yes, sir. Just thinking about how we handle people. I guess I'm still learning that not every rule in the book can teach you how to treat someone right. The sheriff leaned back, his expression thoughtful. That's something only experience can teach. You'll make mistakes, we all do. What matters is whether you learn from them. Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. I think I'm starting to understand that. When he left the office, the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle. He stood outside for a while, watching the reflections of the streetlights shimmer in the puddles. He thought about Marcia, how calm she had been both times, how her presence seemed to carry quiet strength. He didn't know what the future held, but he felt something shift inside him that night. A kind of awakening, small but certain. The next morning, Marcia sat by the window again, sipping tea while the sun broke through the clouds. The storm had passed, leaving the world fresh and bright. Her husband joined her, still half asleep, coffee in hand. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Not much," she admitted. "Too much on my mind," he smiled gently. "You always do." She looked out at the yard, the grass glistening with dew. "You know that young officer, he's trying." "I can tell. He wants to do right," James nodded. "He's got a good heart. Just needs guidance," she smiled faintly. "Then guide him. The world needs more like that." He looked at her thoughtfully. "You really believe people can change, don't you?" "I have to," she said. "If we stop believing that, then what's the point?" Her words hung in the air for a moment. The sheriff reached over and squeezed her hand. "You always see the good even when others can't." She smiled, though her eyes held a hint of sadness. "That's what keeps us human." Meanwhile, Daniel drove his patrol route that afternoon, passing familiar streets, waving at kids on bicycles, stopping to help an elderly man cross the road. The work felt different now, less about enforcing rules and more about protecting the people who lived under them. As the day faded into evening, he pulled over by the same stretch of road once more. The sun dipped low behind the fields, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. He sat there quietly, thinking about how a single meeting could change how someone saw the world. It wasn't about rank or titles. It wasn't even about right or wrong. It was about moments, the kind that revealed character, that stripped away pride and left only truth. He knew the town would soon be buzzing with another week of stories, small problems, and bigger challenges. But he also knew that he was no longer the same man who had sat here days ago, restless and uncertain. He had seen humility. He had seen grace. And, without knowing it, he had been given a second chance to be the kind of officer people could trust. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain still lingering in the fields. He smiled to himself, started the engine, and drove into the fading light, unaware that another test of his character was waiting just around the corner. For now, though the road was quiet, the sky wide open, and his heart a little lighter than before, the air was cooler than usual that morning. A thin layer of fog hung over the town, softening the edges of everything. The streetlights, the rooftops, even the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The quiet felt different this time, as if something was waiting to happen. Officer Daniel Reeves drove down the main street toward the station, sipping coffee that had already gone cold. He had been working longer shifts lately, covering for others, trying to prove himself. People had started to notice his change in attitude, calmer, more patient, more grounded. Some of the older officers teased him for it, saying he'd gone soft, but Daniel didn't care. He wasn't softer, just wiser. The sheriff had been watching him too, quietly proud of his growth. Though Daniel didn't know it, Marcia had spoken to her husband about him again a few nights earlier, telling him how differently Daniel had handled things the last time they met. The sheriff didn't say much, but the look in his eyes had said enough. That day, the town was hosting a big community event downtown, the annual safety fair where police, firefighters, and local volunteers came together to teach families about emergency preparedness. It was one of the sheriff's favorite events because it brought people and officers together in a way that felt more human. Marcia had helped organize it, of course. She always did. She was in charge of the donation booth again, setting up tables with food, blankets, and toys for local shelters. Her calm energy always drew people in. By late morning, the square was buzzing with laughter, music, and children running between booths. Bright banners fluttered in the breeze, and the smell of grilled food filled the air. Daniel arrived in uniform, assigned to help manage traffic and security. He parked near the far end of the square and walked through the crowd, nodding to familiar faces. When he saw Marcia at the donation stand, he smiled to himself. She was laughing with a group of women, her presence warm and steady. He started to approach to say hello, but then his radio buzzed. "Unit 23, we've got a call on Route 7. Possible disturbance involving 2 vehicles. You're the closest. Check it out." He sighed softly, glancing back toward the square before replying. Copy that. On my way. As he left, Marcia looked up briefly, catching sight of him walking toward his car. She smiled, unaware that the next few hours would test everything he had learned about patience, control, and compassion. The drive out to Route 7 took about 15 minutes. It was a quiet, winding road lined with tall trees, leading toward the county's rural edge. When he arrived, he saw two cars pulled to the side, their drivers standing a few feet apart, clearly arguing. Daniel stepped out of his cruiser and approached slowly. "Good afternoon, folks. What's going on here?" The first driver, a man in his 30s, gestured angrily toward the other car. "She nearly sideswiped me. Came out of nowhere." The other driver, a woman visibly shaken, shook her head. "I didn't. You were tailgating me. I just slowed down because—" "Enough," Daniel said firmly but calmly. "Let's keep voices low. No one's hurt, right?" They both shook their heads. "Okay, then let's take a breath. I'll get your information and we'll sort this out." He guided them to stand near their vehicles while he took notes and checked their licenses. It seemed like a small misunderstanding. Tense but manageable. Then over his shoulder he noticed another car slowing down behind the scene. A familiar black SUV. He frowned slightly, realizing who it was even before she stepped out. Marcia, she had been on her way to deliver leftover supplies from the event when she saw the flashing lights and decided to stop. She always made sure everyone was all right when she saw roadside. "Trouble. Officer Reeves," she called gently as she approached. "Everything okay?" He turned surprised. "Mrs. Thompson? What are you doing out here?" "I was heading home," she said. "Just wanted to check if you needed a hand." "Looks serious from the road." He smiled faintly. "I think we're good. Just a disagreement over a lane change." Before they could speak further, the arguing driver raised his voice again. "You cops always take sides. You don't even know what happened." Daniel turned calmly. "Sir, please lower your voice. I'm just trying to help." But the man kept shouting, frustration spilling out. "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong." Marcia stood a few feet away, her hands clasped together, watching the tension rise. She had seen scenes like this before. How quickly things could spiral when tempers took over. "Officer Reeves," she said quietly. "Maybe just ask them to step aside and cool down a bit." He nodded, appreciating her calm suggestion. "That's a good idea." He turned to the man. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but please step over by the guardrail and take a moment. We'll get through this." Something in his steady tone seemed to work. The man muttered under his breath but finally walked a few steps away. Daniel turned back to Marcia and gave her a grateful look. "You have a way with people," he said softly. She smiled. "So do you. You just needed a reminder." He was about to reply when the man's voice broke through again, louder this time. "Wait a second. Isn't that the sheriff's wife?" Marcia froze slightly. Daniel's heart sank. He hadn't planned to mention it, but now the man's words hung in the air. "I've seen you at the station," the man continued. "That's her, isn't it?" Daniel hesitated. "Sir, let's stay focused on the situation here." But the man wasn't finished. "So that's why you're acting calm. You're protecting her. You think just because she's married to the sheriff she can interfere in a case." Marcia's face tightened, though her voice remained composed. "Sir, I was only checking to make sure everyone was safe. I have no involvement here." Daniel stepped between them, his voice firm but measured. "That's enough. No one's getting special treatment. Please step back to your car." The man threw up his hands. "This whole thing's a joke." He turned away, muttering as he stomped back to his vehicle. Silence settled again, heavy and awkward. Marcia sighed softly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't," Daniel said quickly. "He's just upset. You did nothing wrong." Still, he could feel the shift in the air. Something that had been calm a moment ago now carried tension. The moment her identity became known, everything changed. Within the hour, both drivers had signed their reports and left. Daniel watched the taillights fade before turning back to Marcia. "You should get home," he said quietly. "It's been a long day." She nodded, though her eyes lingered on him. "Thank you, Officer Reeves, for staying calm." "Not everyone would have," he smiled faintly. "Guess I had a good teacher." She laughed softly. "Take care of yourself." As she drove away, Daniel stood by his car, staring at the empty stretch of road. The words the man had shouted echoed faintly in his mind. "That's the sheriff's wife." It wouldn't take long before others heard about it. Word traveled fast in small towns. By the time he returned to the station that evening, whispers had already begun. A few officers looked up as he entered, exchanging quiet glances. He could sense the curiosity in the air. "Rough day?" one of them asked with a smirk. Daniel just nodded. "Something like that." He went straight to the sheriff's office. The door was half open, and the sheriff looked up from his desk when Daniel knocked. "Come in," the sheriff said. Daniel stepped inside, hat in hand. "Sir, I wanted to explain before you heard from someone else." The sheriff gestured for him to continue. There was a small traffic dispute on Route 7. Mrs. Thompson stopped by to make sure everyone was okay. Nothing serious, but one of the drivers recognized her. Things got tense for a bit, but it's resolved now. The sheriff listened quietly, then nodded. "I already heard. She called me on the way home." Daniel's shoulders tensed slightly. "I didn't want you to think The sheriff raised a hand gently. "Relax, Reeves. She said you handled it perfectly. Kept things calm, respectful." Relief washed over Daniel's face. "Thank you, sir." The sheriff smiled faintly. "You've come a long way, you know that? A few months ago, that situation might have gone very differently." Daniel nodded, humbled. "Yes, sir. I've learned a lot, especially from her." The sheriff chuckled softly. "She has that effect on people." As Daniel left the office that night, the moon was high again, glowing softly over the quiet streets. He walked slowly to his car, feeling both tired and strangely at peace. He knew more challenges would come. This job always had them. But he also knew something in him had changed for good. Sometimes growth didn't come from grand moments, but from small ones. The kind that tested your patience, your character, your humanity. And as he drove home beneath the silver glow of the moon, Daniel realized that the road to respect wasn't about the badge or the title. It was about humility, kindness, and knowing when to simply listen. The morning sun peeked through thin clouds, warming the small town with a soft golden glow. Birds sang across quiet streets, and people went about their routines, opening shops, sweeping porches, watering gardens. Everything looked calm, but inside the sheriff's department, things were not as peaceful. A story had started spreading through the community, not through official channels, but through whispers, messages, and gossip. Someone had filmed the argument on Route 7, the moment when the angry driver had shouted that Marcia was the sheriff's wife. The short clip had made its way to social media, and by morning it was everywhere in town. The video wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to stir curiosity. People started talking about why she had been there, what had happened before, and what her relationship was with the officer who handled the situation. By the time Officer Daniel walked into the station, he could feel the difference. Conversation stopped when he passed. A few people gave him polite nods, others avoided eye contact. The air carried quiet judgment even from those who didn't mean harm. He went straight to his desk, pretending not to notice. But inside, his stomach was tight. He had done nothing wrong, yet the attention felt heavy. A few minutes later, the sheriff called him into the office. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped inside. The sheriff sat behind his desk, a coffee mug in hand, eyes calm but serious. "Sit down," he said. Daniel sat quietly, waiting. "I assume you've seen the video?" the sheriff asked. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. "It's going around fast," the sheriff nodded slowly. "It is. Folks love to talk, especially when they don't know the whole story." Daniel hesitated before speaking. "I never said anything out of line, sir. I didn't even mention who she was. It just happened." The sheriff studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I know, she told me everything. You did your job right, and I appreciate that." Relief flickered across Daniel's face, but it didn't last long. "There's something else," the sheriff continued. "Some people are questioning whether she should have been there at all. They're saying it looked like interference even though it wasn't. You know how small towns are. Perception matters." Daniel sighed, his voice quiet. "She was just trying to help." "I know," the sheriff said gently. "But now it's become a story. The mayor's office called this morning, and Internal Affairs wants a quick review. It's standard, but still. It means paperwork, questions, and maybe a little noise." Daniel nodded, his throat dry. "I understand." The sheriff leaned back, his tone softer. "Look, Reeves, don't let this shake you. You handled it well. Just keep your head down for now. This will pass." Daniel thanked him and left the office, but as he walked down the hallway, he could hear low murmurs from other officers. Some were curious, others critical. A few sounded supportive, but it didn't matter. It all blended into one cloud of noise that followed him wherever he went. That evening, he drove home in silence, the road ahead stretching out under fading light. The sky turned a pale orange, then deepened into shades of purple and blue. He parked by his small apartment building and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the dashboard. He thought about how quickly things could change, how a single moment, even handled well, could spin into something larger than life. He wasn't angry at Marcia. If anything, he felt sorry that she was being dragged into this. She didn't deserve it. A few days later, the town's newspaper ran a short piece about the incident, mentioning both the sheriff's wife and the young officer involved. They didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but the tone hinted at questions about professional boundaries. That was enough to stir people's imaginations even more. Meanwhile, Marcia stayed home most of that week. The sheriff had asked her to take some time to rest, but he knew it was more than that. She didn't like the attention either. One afternoon, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea watching cars pass by. Neighbors waved from a distance, but she could feel the quiet stares. People curious but polite enough not to ask. The sheriff joined her after work, sitting down beside her with a long sigh. "You doing okay?" he asked. She nodded faintly. "It's just noise. I'll be fine." He looked at her, concern in his eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," she said softly. "But that doesn't stop people from talking." He was quiet for a while before saying, "I think Reeves is taking it harder than you are." She smiled gently. "He's a good man. He's just learning how to handle the weight of other people's words. It takes time." That weekend, the sheriff called for a public meeting at the community center, something he did a few times a year to address local concerns. The hall filled quickly with townspeople sitting in folding chairs waiting to hear what he'd say. The air was thick with whispers and speculation. When the sheriff finally stood at the front, he looked calm and steady. "I've heard a lot of talk this week," he began. "Some of it fair, some not. So let's clear the air. A few days ago, my wife stopped at a roadside scene to make sure everyone was safe. She did not interfere with police work. Officer Reeves handled the situation with complete professionalism." "That's the truth." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The sheriff continued, "Now, if people want to talk about what's really important, let's talk about respect for the law, for each other, and for the people who try to do good without expecting anything in return." The room fell quiet. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Then a few people started clapping, slowly at first, then louder. Soon the entire room joined in. Daniel, standing quietly at the back, felt his chest tighten. The applause wasn't just for the sheriff. It was for truth, for fairness, for something bigger than the rumor itself. After the meeting, as people filed out, Marcia approached Daniel with a warm smile. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. "I wanted to," he replied. "It felt right," she nodded. "Thank you. I know this week hasn't been easy," he shook his head. "I just did my job. You don't have to thank me." She looked at him for a moment, then said gently, "Sometimes doing your job isn't the hardest part. It's keeping your heart steady while everyone's watching." He didn't respond right away, but her words stayed with him long after she left. The following Monday, Internal Affairs released their brief report. There was no evidence of misconduct, no violation of procedure. The situation was officially closed. That evening, the sheriff called Daniel into his office again. "It's done," he said simply. "You can relax now." Daniel nodded, though he didn't feel completely relaxed. The experience had left a mark, a quiet reminder of how fragile reputations could be, and how easily good intentions could be misunderstood. Before he left, the sheriff added, "For what it's worth, I'm proud of how you handled all this." "Thank you." "Sir," Daniel said quietly. Later that night, Daniel went for a walk through town. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and rain. Lights glowed softly in the windows of small shops, and he could hear faint laughter from a diner down the street. It was peaceful again, the kind of peace that only came after storms passed. He passed by the community square where it had all started months ago, remembering that first day when everything went wrong, and how far things had come since then. He paused near the donation booth, now empty but still standing, and smiled faintly. He realized that change didn't come through force or pride. It came through humility, through learning, through moments that tested who you really were when no one was cheering. Back at home, he sat on his porch and looked up at the night sky. The stars were clear, scattered across a deep blue canvas. He thought about the sheriff, about Marcia, about how this town, for all its flaws, had taught him something real. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need to defend himself anymore. What mattered was knowing he had done right, even when others doubted it. As the night grew still, Daniel leaned back in his chair, the cool breeze brushing his face. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and a car engine hummed softly before fading away. For the first time in weeks, his chest felt light again. Sometimes peace doesn't come when the noise stops. It comes when you stop letting the noise decide your worth. And on that quiet night, under a sky full of stars, Daniel finally understood what that meant. Months had passed since the day everything changed. The seasons had turned, the air felt different, and the town had slowly moved on from the story that once filled every whisper. What was once a storm had become just another memory carried quietly by time. Officer Daniel Reeves had settled back into his routine at the station. He still wore the same uniform, drove the same route, and nodded to the same shop owners every morning. But something inside him had shifted. He carried himself differently now, slower to judge, quicker to listen. People noticed the calm in his voice, the patience in his tone. He didn't talk much about what happened. He didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew the truth. On a cool Saturday morning, the town prepared for another community event, the Fall Charity Drive. It was smaller than the summer fair, but just as warm-hearted. The sheriff's office helped organize it every year, and this time, Daniel volunteered to run one of the booths. He arrived early, helping set up tables and hang banners. The air smelled like baked bread and roasted coffee from nearby stalls. Children ran around, chasing one another with painted faces, while music played softly from a speaker near the gazebo. As Daniel arranged pamphlets about safety awareness, a voice called softly behind him, "Good morning, Officer Reeves." He turned and smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson." Marcia stood there holding a tray of cookies wrapped neatly in clear bags. She looked peaceful, the kind of peace that came after surviving something hard. "You're early," he said kindly. "I've learned it's easier to arrive before the crowd," she said, with a small laugh. "Less noise," he nodded, understanding. "You look well. How've you been?" "I'm doing better," she said, her eyes soft. "The last few months gave me time to think. Time to heal." Daniel paused, his voice low. "I'm glad. You didn't deserve what happened and the attention, the talk." She gave a small smile. "Sometimes the only way people learn compassion is when life forces them to look closer. That's what this town needed, and maybe that's what you needed too." He met her eyes, and for a moment there was quiet understanding between them. No anger, no guilt, just the shared weight of what they had both endured and learned from. Throughout the morning, they worked side by side, greeting visitors, handing out pamphlets, laughing with children who came by for candy. It felt normal again, easy, friendly, human. When the sheriff arrived later in the day, he joined them at the booth, wearing his usual half-smile and worn leather hat. He looked around at the cheerful crowd and then back at Daniel. "Not bad for a quiet Saturday," he said. Daniel smiled. "Better than the last one we had together." The sheriff chuckled. "I'll take peaceful over dramatic any day." They all laughed softly. Later that afternoon, the sheriff was asked to say a few words on stage. People gathered around the gazebo, holding cups of cider and warm snacks. Daniel and Marcia stood near the back listening. The sheriff cleared his throat and spoke in his deep, steady voice. "It's been a long year," he began. "Our town has faced its share of challenges. We've seen moments that tested us, not just as officers or citizens, but as people. And yet here we are standing together again. That's something worth being proud of." The crowd listened quietly. He went on. "Sometimes life has a way of teaching lessons we didn't ask for. But if we're wise, we'll take those lessons and use them to do better, to see each other as more than strangers. Because at the end of the day, the badge, the title, the color of our skin, none of that matters as much as how we treat one another." A gentle murmur spread through the crowd. Not applause yet, just quiet reflection. The sheriff looked out over the faces before him and then said, "I want to thank those who reminded us of that. You know who you are." His eyes met Daniel's across the crowd. Then they moved briefly to his wife. Both of them smiled faintly. When the applause finally came, it was warm and genuine. People clapped not just for the sheriff's words, but for the spirit behind them, for the slow, quiet healing that had taken place over months of honesty and grace. After the event ended, Daniel helped pack up tables while the evening light faded to gold. The sky looked painted with soft oranges and purples. Marcia approached him again as he folded the last banner. "I think your sheriff's speech made a few people cry," she said with a gentle laugh. "He has a way with words," Daniel replied. "And maybe people were ready to hear them," she nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes, a little truth at the right time." They stood for a moment, watching families walk home down the quiet street. Laughter echoed in the distance, mixed with the rustling of leaves. Marcia spoke softly. "You know, I used to think forgiveness was about letting others off the hook, but now I think it's more about freeing yourself from the weight you carry." Daniel looked down, thoughtful. "You forgave me." She smiled warmly. "There's nothing to forgive. You already proved who you are by how you changed. That's all that matters." Her words settled over him like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely at peace. As they said goodbye, Marcia handed him a small bag of cookies. "Take these," she said lightly. "You've earned them." He laughed softly. "Thank you, and thank you for everything else." When she left, Daniel lingered a while longer, standing in the empty square. The lamps flickered on one by one, casting a soft glow across the pavement. He could hear faint music playing from a nearby diner. Mingling with the cool night air, he thought about how far he had come, from the nervous young officer who once acted without thinking to the man who now understood that respect was earned through humility and patience. He thought about how a single mistake, painful as it had been, had shaped him into someone better, and he realized that growth often came disguised as hardship. Later that night, he drove out to the edge of town where the road curved along the hilltop. From there, he could see the small town lights shimmering below, warm, steady, unbroken. He turned off the engine and sat quietly, the hum of the wind filling the silence. He remembered the sheriff's words from earlier. "The badge doesn't make the man. The heart does." Those words stayed with him. He leaned back against the seat, looking up at the stars scattered across the sky. They looked endless, like tiny reminders that life went on, that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new chances to do good, to be better. Somewhere in the distance, he could see the faint light from the sheriff's house on the hill. He imagined Marcia sitting by the window with her cup of tea, calm and strong as ever. He smiled to himself. Maybe life wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about learning to carry it with grace, to let it remind you where you came from and who you want to be. As he sat there, a small voice on the radio called out, a routine dispatch, nothing urgent. He answered calmly, starting the engine again. The red and blue lights flickered faintly against the road as he pulled back toward town. The streets were quiet now. A gentle mist hung in the air. The town that had once judged him now trusted him. The people who once whispered now waved when he passed. And as he drove slowly through those familiar roads, Daniel realized something simple but powerful. Redemption didn't always come with applause or headlines. Sometimes it came quietly, in the way you carried yourself when no one was watching. He parked near the station, turned off the lights, and stepped out into the night. The stars were still shining, and the wind carried the faint scent of autumn leaves. He stood there for a long time, breathing it all in, feeling both small and strong at once. He had learned that true respect didn't come from authority, but from empathy. It came from listening before speaking, from caring before judging. As he walked toward the station doors, he looked back one last time at the calm streets behind him. Then he smiled, not the kind of smile people see, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing you've finally made peace with yourself. And with that, he stepped forward, ready for whatever the next day would bring, not as the officer people once questioned, but as the man who had learned what it really meant to serve with heart.